And Bruce, you worked with polling for a very long time. You were more than 10 years ago part of creating what you are now going to present. You're a journalist, you understand political logic, and now you're part of running the Pew polling. And you're very much welcome here. We're very grateful to the US Embassy who has facilitated this. And I think without further ado, why don't you start on your presentation? And then, Gina, you'll come up and give us some comments. Thanks a lot.
Mats, thank you so much for the kind invitation to speak today. This is not the first time I've spoken at the Institute, and I've always enjoyed these conversations, not so much because of what I have to say, but the kinds of questions and comments that I hear from the audience. So I very much look forward to your questions, because it helps us understand how people see the United States. And I think that's terribly important, because whether we like it or not, and I think if I were a Swede I'd resent it, but the reality is when America elects a president, they elect a president of the world, not just a president of the United States. And I think Americans unfortunately fail often to understand that the ramifications of the choices we make for president really are felt all over the world. So I really appreciate your interest in the election and American public opinion about issues that may affect the world. I also am very appreciative of the fact that you came out in such a very cold morning. Who says there's global warming? Clearly, this confirms all the skeptics' view that global warming exists. I say that as a joke, I bet. Because we did a survey of 40 countries earlier last year, the largest survey ever done, and basically, there is no climate skepticism in the publics around the world. Everybody believes that climate change is happening, whatever some people might argue. But that's an aside. What I'm going to share with you today are the results of public opinion surveys we've done recently in the United States, looking at American public views about a range of foreign policy issues and also about the upcoming election. This is work that is done by the Pew Research Center, where I work. We've been around since 1996. We've been doing international polling since 2002. We are funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is one of those old American foundations, God bless them, money from the 19th century that is now invested in research. The Pew Charitable Trust believes, quaintly, that good public policy comes from good information, and thank goodness they're willing to fund us to do public opinion research to try to understand what the public believes. We are nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy. I like to joke that I can tell you we discovered 1 + 1 + 1, but I can't tell you it equals 3. You have to interpret what it means. And the most important thing to know is that everything I'm going to show you, and much, much, much more, is on our website. It is free, but most importantly, it is searchable. So if you ever wondered whether Kenyans believe in climate change, we've asked them. If you ever wondered, how do the Spanish feel about same-sex marriage, we've asked them. So there's an enormous amount of material there that you might find of interest. I hardly recommend you take a few minutes and go to the site. We don't do horse race polling per se. Who do you think you're going to vote for if the election were today? There's a gazillion polls in the United States that now do that. So this is not the results of our work, but a compilation done by Real Clear Politics in the United States, looking at the average for the various candidates of the most recent polls over time. And it just confirms what I think you already know, that Donald Trump leads in the national polls. Bear in mind, we're not about yet to have a national election. That's not until November. So take these results these days as with a huge grain of salt, because things can change very rapidly. But right now he is very much ahead in the national polls. Senator Cruz from Texas is second. Senator Rubio from Florida is third. Notice how low Jeb Bush is. I can tell you 6, 9 months ago, if you had asked me, I would have bet you a lunch that Jeb Bush was going to be the nominee for the Republicans in the presidency. And he is stuck in single digits. Miracles do happen in politics, but there's no evidence of a miracle yet. On the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton is the clear leader and the clear favorite at this point. Nationally, the polls are showing that Senator Sanders from Vermont is closing the gap. As you know, Senator Sanders is an avowed democratic socialist, which in Sweden would probably get him elected. In the United States, it's never gotten anybody ever elected. So we'll see how that goes. But it's really down to Clinton or Sanders, which I think conventional wisdom is that Hillary Clinton will still prevail and become the Democratic nominee, although as it would appear that the race is tightening a bit. We ask people, this is our survey results, we ask Republicans and Democrats, would you rather see your party nominee someone president who is a very conservative, somewhat conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal? As you can see, basically this year, Republicans want a conservative nominee. Democrats don't want a liberal nominee. They want a moderate nominee, which again suggests that Hillary Clinton might prevail simply because she's more moderate than Senator Sanders. The economy, Bill Clinton once said, it's the economy, stupid, when talking about how people vote. The American public today does not think the economy is doing well, but certainly Democrats think it's doing better than Republicans believe it's doing. Now, we can have a huge debate, if you want to, in the question and answer session about whether the American economy is doing well or not relative to other countries, relative to where it was. But the public is not convinced the economy is doing well. And this is what is fueling, I think, some of the anger, especially on the right. Voter interest is terribly important in an election. I mean, how much time are you devoting to thinking about this election? Admittedly, 9 months, 11 months before the election. But it would appear that the Republicans are more engaged. Republican voters are more engaged with this election than Democrats, which does give the Republicans hope that that means that Republicans are more likely to turn out to vote on Election Day. We ask people every year in the United States, what are the most important problems facing the country today? This was a survey done just a couple of weeks ago in December. For one of the first times in recent years, international issues ranked higher than domestic issues. So it's not the economy stupid right now. It is foreign policy stupid. That is, especially terrorism, that is on the minds of Americans. You can see that, and this is in the wake of the San Bernardino terrorist attack, in the wake of the Paris attacks. Terrorism has become very high on people's concern list. I can tell you Gallup ran a similar survey just last week, 2-3 days ago. They found that the economy had come back as an issue. So terrorism concerns seem to have gone down, but I think this suggests how volatile this issue is. And if there were another terrorist attack, which unfortunately we probably all can presume might happen, this conceivably is, for the first time in many, many years in the United States, an election that may turn on international issues, because we normally are more inwardly looking and more inwardly focused. What's interesting is that Republicans are more worried about international issues than Democrats. It's Republicans who are more worried about terrorism than Democrats. And if you listen to the debates in the Republican primaries, it's all about those people out there who are going to come and get us. And so the debate in the Republican Party is, in fact, reflecting and probably feeding the underlying concern about terrorism and international issues. Different set of questions. We asked people in December, what are about international threats, and which ones are you most worried about? It's ISIS. It's terrorism. It is the issue of the day. Notice that it's not that Democrats are, or it's not that people were not worried about ISIS in August of 2014. It's just they're much more worried about it now than they were in the past. If you look at the party breakdown on these international threats in the United States, again, it's not that Democrats are not worried about ISIS. 79% of Democrats are worried about ISIS, but it's 93% of Republicans are. So it's a much more salient issue among Republican voters. And notice at the very bottom, Democrats are worried about climate change. Republicans are definitely not worried about climate change. And I can tell you, if you go to our website and look at our survey on climate change, on every climate change related issue, and we ask about 10 different questions about climate change, it's the Democrats who are worried about climate change. It's not Republicans. We ask people, which party do you think would do a better job dealing with the issues you just told us you're worried about? And as you can see, the Republicans have a very definite advantage in terms of dealing with terrorist threats, whereas Democrats have an advantage if you're talking about the environment or climate change. I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a prediction. This election's not going to be about climate change. So the Democratic advantage on this doesn't necessarily help the Democrats. In terms of terrorism, which is the issue that people tell us they're most worried about internationally, Republicans are far more worried about terrorism at home and abroad than are Democrats. This is a Republican more than a Democratic issue. And this will highlight a theme throughout this conversation. The partisanship on issues in the United States cannot be underestimated. As bad as you think the partisanship is in the United States, I can tell you it is worse. And it's not just a partisanship in Congress or in Washington, which you read about. It is a partisanship among the general public. There is a survey we did, 10,000 people, it's on our website, about partisanship in the American body politic. On almost any question, we are a very deeply divided people along partisan lines. I recommend taking a look at it. Just to give you one hint about it, a quarter of Democrats and a third of Republicans in the United States think the other party is a threat to the national well-being. How do you have a functioning democracy where you have to make compromises if you believe the people you are compromising with are a threat to the national well-being? This is the fundamental challenge we face as a nation, and I think it cannot be overestimated. We ask people how you think the government's doing in protecting the country from terrorism. Republicans are much more likely to say that the government's doing a bad job than Democrats. The terrorist threat and what's going on in Syria and Iraq are intimately linked in people's minds. We ask people, how is this effort going, fighting Islamic militants in Iraq and Syria? People consistently believe it's not going well. They do support what's being done. It's not that people are against it. They think it's a good idea. We're bombing in Syria and Iraq, but they don't think it's going well. There's not a great deal of support for reintroducing massive numbers of American troops into the region. As you can see, overall, 47% of Americans say it'd be a good idea, 47% say it's a bad idea. But what's interesting is the partisan division. 2/3 of Republicans want to reintroduce American forces into the Middle East. 2/3 of Democrats are opposed to that. So this is one of the issues where the partisan divide really shows itself. And I think going forward, it's why you see Republican candidates being much more aggressive on what should be done in Syria as opposed to the Democratic candidates. Nevertheless, the American public remains optimistic that this effort will succeed. Even though they don't think it's going well now, they're divided on what to do, they still think it will succeed. Obviously, NATO and Russia and Ukraine are off the front pages right now because the fighting in Ukraine seems to have subsided. But what's interesting is that Americans, only 49% of Americans have a favorable view of NATO. This hasn't changed very much over the years. Notice the decline in support for NATO in Germany. This is not a lecture about Germany, but I just would point out to you, there's been an 18 percentage point drop in support of NATO in Germany. Americans are willing to come to the aid of Western Europe against if a NATO ally is attacked by Russia. By the way, Europeans are not willing to go to each other's aid. 58% of Germans say they would not come to the aid of another NATO ally if they were attacked by Russia. Just might remind you of that as you have your debate about NATO. What's interesting for the sense of this debate is when you talk about Russia and what to do about Russia and Ukraine, it is a partisan issue in the United States. When I say that 58% of Americans say they'd go to the defense of a NATO ally if attacked by Russia, it's Republicans who would go to the defense of a NATO ally if attacked by Russia. Only 47% of Democrats would do that. So, and no matter what you ask the public in America about, would you give aid to Ukraine? Would you send troops? Would you let them into NATO? Again, it's a very partisan issue. China is another area where we see much debate. Those of you who might have listened to the debate yesterday in the United States, again, Mr. Trump said he would impose a tariff on Chinese imports to the United States. He's at one point said it would be 45%. He now denies he said that, but he's on record as saying that. This appeals to an American antipathy towards China. As you can see, over the years we've asked people, how do you have a favorable, unfavorable view of China? Over half the American people have an unfavorable view of China and have now for several years, and it's as bad as it's ever been. And when we ask people what it is they're worried about, it's trade, basically. So that's one of Trump's appeals. Now, this unfavorable, favorable view of China is again a partisan issue. Republicans are much more likely to have an unfavorable view of China than Democrats. Older people are much more likely to have an unfavorable view of China than younger people. And remember, the Republican Party in the United States is older than the Democratic Party, the people who vote for that party. Young people are more likely to be Democrats. Older people are more likely to be Republicans. And almost every China-related issue, as I said, most concern to the Americans are trade-related issues, but in every case, Republicans are more combative, aggressive, worried, whatever, than are Democrats. And in terms of what to do about China, do we send more military forces to Asia? Do we sign this Trans-Pacific Partnership? Again, it is Democrats who are likely to see the TPP as a good thing. Republicans don't. But Republicans are more likely to say they'd go to the defense of an Asian ally against China than are Democrats. So again, partisan. Finally, if this election is a referendum on how Barack Obama has handled international affairs, the Democrats may be in trouble. Basically, more than half the public believe that Obama has done a bad job. They disapprove of his handling of foreign policy and have for a number of years now. They don't think he is tough enough. This is a charge about him that has stuck, and people don't think he's tough enough on foreign affairs. But again, it's partisan. 84% of Republicans say President Obama has not been tough enough in foreign policy, whereas 58% of Democrats say he's been about right. So even on this issue of is he tough enough, it really is a partisan issue. Finally, because we don't have time to get into it, but if you want to, we can in the question and answer. On economic engagement, because I know foreigners always worry about protectionist sentiment in the United States. One thing you got to know is we ask people every year, what are the biggest challenges facing America? Every year, people say trade is among the least concerning issue on their agenda. So whatever you think about the American public, whether you think they're a protectionist or not, basically they really don't think about trade very much. I can tell you briefly, when we ask people in America, do you think trade's good for the country? Two-thirds of the public say yes. We are philosophically free traders. when you ask the public, well, does trade create jobs or destroy jobs? No, it destroys jobs. Do you think it raises wages? It lowers wages. Do you think it's good for the economy? It's bad for the economy. Americans are infinitely capable of holding mutually contradictory emotions about trade. They think it's good for the country and they think it's bad for them. But half the public support TTIP and half the public support TPP. So there is, again, in principle, we're in favor of this. In practice, we have real doubts. And I can tell you the thing that I want to disabuse you with on this issue is you all carry around in your heads, as do all Americans, that Republicans are free traders and Democrats are protectionist. The data I could show you if we had time are conclusive. Democrats are free traders and Republicans are protectionist. This may not have been the way it was in the past. It is the way it is today, and it's probably because the demography of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has changed. The Republican Party is increasingly the party of old white men. It's the guys I went to high school with who thought they had a future in manufacturing and didn't go to college. 2/3 of my high school graduating class went to work in the steel mills. They did not go to college. That did not work out. They're now in their 60s. Their lives didn't work out the way they'd hoped it would. Their incomes fell. Their mobility didn't happen. And they're upset, and they're going to vote for Trump. And the Democratic Party is increasingly a party of young people and minorities. And our surveys show that young people are more open to the world than older people, and minorities are more open to the world than white people. And as a result, it's understandable now that Republicans may be more protectionist because of who the Republicans are these days, and the Democrats are more protectionist, are more free trade because of who they are. And that's part of, I think, what are the explanation in the partisanship. The demography of the parties has changed over time. But anyway, I've talked way too long. Let's get into conversation.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. Wonderful and so interesting. This is what we came for. Look, your presentation invites a lot of discussion on the interpretation of the data. It shows huge partisanship, but as we know, also within the parties, we have great divisions, and this year particularly within the Republican Party. I'm later on going to challenge you on the role of polling and the understanding and the reliability of polling, because I think many of us here have come over time to doubt more and more the validity of polling, but perhaps you can come back to that. Yeah. Right now I'd like to invite Gina Lindberg to the podium for a commentary or her perspectives. As all of us here know, she runs the foreign policy or foreign affairs side of Swedish public broadcasting with a great public radio, with a great experience from the United States, having been our correspondent there for 6 years, 2007 to 2013. Gina, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege to share the floor with you, Bruce. This was such an interesting presentation, and it's fascinating to hear about the new trends in attitudes. As a journalist, I have to say that I love the Pew Research Center. I've been there. I've been there countless times on L Street, is it right, in Washington? It's a gold mine of knowledge and statistics, as you pointed out, on everything. I could ask any question, and they would say, "I'll get back to you," and they did, and always with solid answers. It's truly a fantastic institution. So my name is Gina Lindberg. I'm, as Mats said, head of foreign news at the Swedish public service radio, Sveriges Radio. And before that, I was based in Washington, D.C. as a correspondent for 6 years. 6 years that were transforming U.S. politics. I covered both of President Obama's and then Senator Obama's elections. And had the privilege to be there for his inauguration in 2009, together with 2 million other people on the mall in Washington, D.C., on a cold day just like this. And I've been covering U.S. politics for some time. This upcoming election will be the 5th presidential election that I cover. And all American elections are truly fascinating. And this time around, I find the state of US campaign politics maybe more intriguing than ever, more weird than ever, or should we say more unpredictable than ever. So we are now, is it 16 days from the caucus in Iowa, and it has for sure been an interesting week in US politics, with the President's State of the Union this week and a lively Republican debate yesterday. And I have to say, when I have covered campaign meetings and been out on the campaign trail during earlier campaigns, when I talk to voters, people always talk about domestic issues. They talk about economy, they talk about kitchen table issues, they talk about college loans, college funding, unemployment, things like that. But as you pointed out, this year it's different. It is going to be a year when foreign policy and national security issues are in the forefront of the campaigns. The recent attacks by ISIL, the Islamic State, the self-proclaimed Islamic State, have led to an intense debate, of course, about how to fight terrorism abroad and in the US. There is the heated immigration debate, where some candidates, among them Mr. Trump, tend to link immigration and refugee issues to terror threat. There's the current debate over military spending, relations with Iran, with China, and the international trade deals, the TPP and the TTIP. So all these are pressing foreign policy issues facing the United States and facing the candidates, and the different policies that they are proposing show how polarized the American political field is this election year. On one hand, we have a Republican frontrunner, Donald Trump, who has called for a temporary ban on Muslims entering the US. He also wants to build a wall on the border with Mexico to stop the flow of undocumented immigrants. He wants to bomb the hell out of ISIL, as he puts it, and this is also a candidate who early on in the campaign said that he learned about foreign policy by watching cable TV shows. That's on one side. On the other side, on the other hand, we have a Democratic frontrunner who is a former Secretary of State with a very close connection to the current administration. So don't say American politics aren't exciting. It's a very vast field here. When it comes to foreign policy, virtually every Republican candidate has blasted President Obama as weak on these issues. But the candidates on the Republican sides are split on foreign policy issues, and not always along the usual party lines. If you look at the Middle East, for example, we have candidates from both parties who promote regime change in Syria. Hillary Clinton is on the same side here as Republicans like Marco Rubio, like Jeb Bush and Chris Christie. They want to oust the Syrian leader, Bashar al-Assad, and they see the ousting of al-Assad as a key to defeating the Islamic State. On the other side, we have Republicans like Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, together with Democrats like Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley, who suggest that it might be better to keep authoritarian leaders in power, including al-Assad. And they argue that that's a way to hinder the growth of extremism and terrorism. So this shows how divided the field is when it comes to foreign policy and how to look at extremism, how to look at ISIL, and how to look at regime change, which was, as we all know, a focal point for President George Bush's administration. There's also an interesting development when it comes to foreign policy, who is a hawk and who is a dove. The roles are not clear, they are no longer given when it comes to doves and hawks, and a Republican can be more of a dove than a Democrat, and vice versa. When it comes to national security, the security apparatus, as you know, when President Obama took office, I think the expectations, not at least here in Europe and here in Sweden, where 98% of the voters said that we were going to vote for President Obama, if we could vote, which we wish we could, so 98% of Swedes and Europeans said that they supported President Obama. And when he took office, I think that the European expectations and also American expectations on many sides were that the policies of President Bush's war on terror were going to be ended. Some of the policies have changed, like the interrogation programs and the CIA detention centers that have closed, but many are still in place. And what we have seen since President Obama took office is a probably bigger continuity in the anti-terrorism policies than many expected, based on the rhetoric and the message during his campaign in 2008. I'm talking about, obviously, the deadly drone strikes, also the vast surveillance program that had been exposed by Edward Snowden, among others. So the question now is whether the next president, the next administration, will embrace those policies or end them or maybe expand them. Donald Trump has said that he favors the use of harsh interrogation techniques, including waterboarding. It works, he says. He favors bulk surveillance, and he has proposed, after the attacks in Paris in November, to expand counter-terrorism efforts. He has also proposed to register Muslims in the United States in a national database, a federal database. And also, as I mentioned earlier, he has proposed to ban, temporarily at least, Muslims to enter the United States. Republican Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, they differ a lot on these issues on national security and are fighting over policies, especially when it comes to how to look at surveillance programs, where Rubio accuses Cruz of being weak on these issues. On the other hand, on the Democratic side, there are big divisions between Hillary Clinton and her rival Bernie Sanders, where Bernie Sanders generally calls for less American interventions around the world, while Mrs. Clinton often refers to the special responsibilities that the US has as the strongest nation on earth, as President Obama put it in his State of the Union the other day. If we don't lead, there will be a vacuum, Hillary Clinton often says in her stump speeches. And Hillary Clinton has recently put forth a policy plan to defend the US homeland from terrorist attacks, and she has called for a so-called intelligence surge to counter groups like ISIL. So how the rest of the world will be affected, how we will be affected by the new US administration, it depends. We don't know yet. It depends not only on who will be elected as president, but it also depends, obviously, on the result of the congressional election, which tends to be overshadowed by the show of the presidential election. What we have seen, I completely agree with you, Bruce, that the last year in Washington, we have seen an almost complete gridlock due to differences between the parties and due to differences between Congress and the White House. And this, we know, it is going to be a very dramatic election year in the US, but when it comes to lawmaking in Washington, don't expect much action this year. What we see now in US politics is an extremely polarized situation. Washington is divided. The partisanship is worse than you can imagine. And I think it was very telling that President Obama introduced his last State of the Union the other night by saying, this is election season, expectations for what we will achieve this year are low. So this is without doubt, I think, the biggest challenge for the next president in the White House. How to fix US politics, how to bridge the gap between Congress and the White House, between Republicans and Democrats. And that was also what President Obama said was his biggest regret the other night in Congress. He said that he regrets that he has not been able to bridge the gap and to fix US politics. It's a huge challenge, and we will see who is up for the task. And with that, I will leave it back to you, Mats.
Thank you, Ina, and thank you for reminding us of two things. Once again, about how split the picture is, and also why we may be reviewing the policies of candidates. It is by far certain that the policies will be implemented by the president, as Obama has sadly found out, which reminds us also that we ought to be looking at the congressional and senatorial races as well to see how how Congress is going to develop. But while this educated audience prepares a few questions, Bruce, would you answer my question about the reliability of polls and your experience? Are you going into more risk territory or less? What have you learned over time?
Since I'm not a professional pollster by academic training, I don't have my PhD in polling, as do about half of my staff. I will tell you it is an art, not a science. They blanch when I say that. Of course it's a science from their point of view, but I think we have to be honest with ourselves. There is a science in how you design the methodology, how you lay out the survey, who you ask, how you ask them, etc., how you word the questions. That's a very scientific process. And we're very proud that The Economist magazine calls us the gold standard in polling.
I thought Nate Silver took that.
What?
Nate Silver took that, I thought.
Yes, well, I'm not so sure that he does the same kind of polling we do. But nevertheless, you're only as good as your most recent poll. Mm. And I think that you as consumers of polls should, it's incumbent upon you to look at the methodology, to try to figure out, does this make sense the way, I mean, if people tell you it was on a computer and we ask 300 people, be very, very wary of the results. Computer surveys miss poor people, they miss old people, and there are ways you can statistically adjust for that, but it's, again, be very wary. There is an infamous example in the US in the last election where there was one pollster who consistently said that Mr. Romney was going to win. It turned out, in retrospect, he wasn't calling people who owned cell phones. Now, at that point, somewhere between 30 and 40% of Americans only use cell phones. Who were those people? Poor people, young people. Who voted for Mr. Obama? Poor people, young people, people of color. So basically he missed his poll was right among the people he was calling, but he was calling the wrong people. We will this year be surveying 75% of our phone calls are with people with cell phones. I mean, so we're constantly trying to adapt our methodology to the new reality. But again, that's terribly important. And the second advice I would have to you as consumers of polls, read the question and see if you think the question is fair. Does the question, it's very easy, inadvertently or advertently, to write a question that tips the balance, that puts its finger on the scale. You will frequently see polls done by official organizations, the Eurobarometer being one of them. How much do you love the European Union? That probably tends to move the audience in a certain direction. You know, on the other hand, you know, if a poll says, you know, how much do you hate Muslims? Well, I mean, this is, again, going in the other. So you really have to look at the question. And I can tell you honestly that we spend days, we're working on the 2016 poll, we spend literally weeks going over the wording of the question. And invariably, when you get the answers back at the, a month, 3 or 4 months from now, you'll say, my God, why did we ask the question that way? We didn't understand what we were asking, and we got a response that we couldn't understand. So this is, as I say, it's an art as well as a science. And I know that there have been polls that have been wrong, horribly wrong, recently. But I do think that there's only one thing worse than polling, and that is no polling, because we have to try to understand what the public thinks, because otherwise we can't understand how they vote, why are they in the streets, or how are they acting in the marketplace.
Thanks, Bruce. Well, let's have a couple of rounds of questions. May I ask you to be very specific with the questions? I think that's, and brief, I think that's in the interest of everyone. There's a gentleman right there, Sarah. If you would pass the mic up here. And Ylva, if you would be ready over there. For the next one, I'll take three at a time. And if you also would be brief in your responses, then we can get a lot said, I think. Yes? Sir?
Thank you very much. A question directly to Bruce. Being a sociologist from Germany, I try to understand why we have to deal with all these, from a German view, depressing details and issues. Is it a fundamental thing? Is America still some kind of an integrated society? Or is it somehow on its way to fall apart, which might explain some of these details we have to deal with?
Thank you. Up there.
Yes, my question is for Mr. Stokes. The New York Times a few days ago published a story suggesting that Hillary Clinton's campaign was terrified of Bernie Sanders. Based on your organization's research, do you think that report was an exaggeration? Thank you.
Europeans with Europeans with a very sluggish growth place great hope in the intended trade pact.
Yeah.
Now, since trade issues are low grade, do you think it could sail through during the latter part of Obama, or that the next president could be, whoever it is, could sort of find it a very useful implement of rather low conflict intensity?
Thanks a lot. Would you like to take the questions? Is the country falling apart? The burn factor and with the trade pact?
If you go to our website, there is this study on partisanship in the United States. And it goes back to, I think, 92 or 96, I can't remember which. And clearly, we are more partisan now than we have been in that 20-some year period. I mean, I can't say we're more partisan than we were in the 1890s or whatever. No, we didn't have polling data, so we don't know. But if by integrated you mean, are we politically integrated, I think the answer to your question is no. We are increasingly not politically integrated. We are increasingly a divided society. That survey shows that consistent conservatives, in other words, people who consistently give you conservative responses to a whole battery of questions, are more likely to say, I want to live in a neighborhood where everybody thinks like me, and consistent liberals are more likely to say, most of my friends think like me. We are conservatives more than liberals, but both are at fault here, tend to say they get most of their information from only conservative or liberal sources of news. Half of consistent conservatives in our survey say they only get their news from Fox News. Now, when I was growing up, that wasn't possible, right? There were 3 television stations, that's all you had. They were kind of consistent, middle of the road establishment, and you got a kind of coherent national view of what was going on in the world. Now you get the view that reinforces your own prejudices or your own kind of perspective. And I don't know how you would change that, because we all live in a digital world where we can select what's coming in. But we are ideologically self-segregating ourselves. So from that point of view, I don't think we're more integrated. Now, we are more integrated racially, we are more integrated ethnically, even religiously, but we are, I think, less integrated politically. On Bernie Sanders, I mean, clearly Sanders is doing better than anybody predicted. I can't comment on how worried the Clinton campaign is, but one would presume they're more worried than they were 6 or 8 months ago when no one thought the Sanders campaign had any hope. The most recent polls in Iowa and New Hampshire show Sanders beating Clinton. The interesting thing to watch, it seems to me, let's assume he does that propel him then into victory in subsequent states, or are Iowa and New Hampshire so unique and so different and kind of out of touch with kind of mainstream America that it doesn't matter? Do remember that for the most part, people who win those don't become president. Remember President Huckabee, who won the Iowa primary, the Iowa caucuses in the past, or President McCain. You know, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be president or even the nominee. On the other hand, there will be a media rush to Sanders and a boomlet of interest in Sanders if he and more questions about Senator Clinton and her viability if she loses those two races. On TTIP, I know the goal now is to get TTIP done this year. That's the stated goal. I wouldn't want you to bet a whole lot of your hard-earned savings on that. I mean, the Pew Research Center has no views on TTIP. Before I worked at the Pew Research Center, I wrote a lot about this, and I was a very strong advocate of it, so I take everything I say about it with a grain of salt. I think it's an important thing. It is on nobody's radar screen in the United States. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is the issue of the day in trade. It's not at all clear that will get voted on this year in Congress. So TTIP is still in the realm of the next presidency. I do think it probably would be less challenging to some people than TPP. You know, it is a deal between rich countries as opposed to a deal between a rich country and a poor country, which obviously has different challenges for people's fears. And as I say, half of the American public, in theory, thinks increasing free trade with Europe is a good idea. Now, we get closer to a vote in Congress, those numbers will go down just because that's what always happens when the opponents become more vocal. But it's a long way off.
You know?
Can I just add on TTIP that President Obama is going to Germany in April to visit Angela Merkel and is expected to talk obviously about TTIP during this visit. But as a journalist, I have to say I'm astonished by the little coverage that TTIP is getting in American media. It's not on top of the political agenda, and it's certainly not on top of the media agenda either. So it seems unlikely that it is something that people are going to push for in Congress. And just a quick comment on Bernie Sanders. I think it's very interesting to look at the polls in Iowa and New Hampshire right now, where he's surging. And if he will win there, it will be interesting also to look at the donations, because the pattern of donations, the many small donors that he has, reminds us of another candidate, then Senator Barack Obama, who had a similar pattern of not the big donors, but many small ones.
And one of the challenges that Hillary Clinton faces, it seems to me, is that there's not the level of enthusiasm about her campaign that there seems to be among some voters for the Sanders campaign. And as you think about Clinton's possibility to become president, I mean, one of the assumptions I think people made was that women would flock to her because this is the chance for her to have the first female president of the United States. Women my age feel very strongly about this issue. It's clear that younger women, millennial women, this is not a big driving issue for them in terms of, yeah, it'd be nice if there's a woman, but that doesn't really motivate me to support Clinton. So it'll be interesting to watch as we get closer to the general election, and let's assume that Clinton is the Democratic nominee, which is probably still the assumption most people make. Are women flocking to her candidacy who otherwise would vote Republican? 56% of white women in the United States voted for Romney. If, as we get closer to the general election, that number goes down, who will vote Republican, and the number of white women who would vote for a Democrat goes up, then Clinton's gender is having a real appeal. If if 56% of white women continue to say they're going to vote for then that gender issue has not worked for Clinton. And I think that's something to watch very closely.
There's that saying in US politics that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line behind a candidate. And this year around, it seems to be the other way around. The Democrats are falling in line, maybe behind Hillary Clinton, and some Republicans, many Republicans seem to fall in love with a certain Donald Trump.
Interesting. Okay, one more round. Let's quickly hear first. Where was it?
Is anything known if Donald Trump has any advisors, or does he run his own show?
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm wondering, you put a lot of labels on this election. It's very polarized, and its national security is very high. Seeing it from a more historical perspective, this could be the first time the US gets a female president, and it could also be, as I believe, the first time the Democrats sits 3 times in a row, right? And it might also be the first time, I guess, that the US gets a president with no political experience whatsoever. So I'm asking for other labels except for the ones you've said, or other characteristics of this election.
Pass it behind you, please. Then it was this.
John Turek Carlson. I'm sort of an independent consultant. In the European system, we look at the role of the parliament in foreign policy. We look at the role of the parties. In the US system, the House, the new Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, is, according to an article in Wall Street Journal the other day, is building now a new caucus in the House, a foreign policy sort of caucus, which then presumably will be sort of quite influential and powerful. Now, the House, of course, with their 2-year mandate terms, it's very volatile and fluctuating. But Gina was mentioning a little bit about what are we likely to see in terms of the composition of the House and, of course, of the Senate after the election, which might become much more important than actually who is winning the presidency. Thanks.
Thanks. 2 more questions, then I'll turn to you, Gina, and then Bruce, you will end the session. 1 more.
I have a question regarding possible voter turnout differences between the candidates, if you have any thoughts on that.
And the last question from here.
It seems the United States, United States, a two-party system, which is different from what is happening in Europe. So the kind of polling you have very nicely explained to us wouldn't be easy to do. I mean, perhaps I would say in my country, in Spain, first of all, the way you vote is a secret. You cannot ask anybody who are you voting for. In which way does Pew handle this issue? Do you address yourself to those who are registered as member of one of the 2 parties, or do you address to a person and ask directly, are you going to vote Democrat or going to vote Republican? So to make this very strict division between red and blue. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, you both have 5 minutes to respond, not 5 each. 5 together. So Gina first, and then Bruce.
Thank you. Just quickly on the congressional election, it looks good for the Republicans when you look at the opinion polls, but it all depends on who will be the Republican candidate, right? Because if Donald Trump would become the candidate for the Republican Party, there are many party leaders and people in the Republican establishment who have voiced their worry about how this will affect Republican, more moderate voters. And they are frankly scared that he is unable to unite the party, and that a Trump win will mean that the Republicans will actually lose their majority in both chambers. When it comes to Trump's advisors, foreign policy advisors, it's a mystery to me. Do you have the answers, Bruce? He hasn't answered. We don't know.
We don't know. Right. I have no idea who Trump's advisors are on foreign policy. On the question of Congress, right. I think that if the Republicans nominate, I think the worry is that Trump could lead to Republican voters staying home or voting Democratic. But But I think the presumption is otherwise, that if the Republicans prevail in the White House, the Republicans will continue to control the House of Representatives. In fact, the assumption is that even if Clinton were to become president, the Republicans would still control the House of Representatives. And then the question is, would the Senate flip back to Democratic control if Clinton's president, or stay Republican? Certainly, if you have a Republican Senate, a Republican House, and a Republican White House, the ability for Congress and the White House to actually agree on things and get things done would improve. I think we don't know what would happen if the Democrats continue to control the White House and the Republicans continue to control Congress, but certainly the last 6 years have not given us much hope that there'd be a lot of comity and working together on issues. You mentioned voter turnout. It seems to me this is the key issue. 60% of African Americans actually turned out to vote in the last election. This was the first time that African American voters had voted at the same level as white voters. Now, first of all, it's appalling that only 60% of whites or blacks voted, but anyway, that's a separate American issue. But if I were a Democrat and I'm thinking about the election, can I presume that 60% of African Americans are going to show up for a white candidate when they, took a black candidate to get the level of voter participation among blacks to 60%? I think the presumption has got to be that they'll vote Democratic probably, but they won't necessarily turn out with the same intensity, and that is a challenge for the Democrats. There's turnout issues with Hispanics, maybe not as great given the Republican candidates' almost uniform criticism of Hispanics, but as we said, women, where women vote is going to be crucial. We don't, to answer your question about registered voters, likely voters, we believe that at this early stage, it's a waste of time to ask people, do you intend to vote in November? Because people don't know, and they just aren't as engaged yet. When you get closer to the election, then it's more useful to ask about your intentions to vote, and whether people, what's the response if they're among likely voters as opposed to just people who say they're Republican or Democrat. Bear in mind now that independents are the largest single group of self-identified voters. We ask people, other people, do you consider yourself a Republican? Do you consider yourself a Democrat? Do you consider yourself an independent? And bear in mind, in America, you're not a card-carrying member of a party. That's a European thing. I mean, so it's how you identify yourself. But I can tell you, when we then analyze the spectrum of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, and look at the answers people give to a whole range of questions, you can then divide the independents into likely Republicans, likely Democrats, based on how they respond to all sorts of other questions. And actually, the number of people who are truly independent in the United States is actually very small. People tend to lean one way or the other, even though they feel good about themselves by identifying themselves as independent. Well, I don't really identify with either of these parties. When you look at their values and their positions on issues, they're Republicans or Democrats. And so don't overinterpret the large number of independents in these surveys, because I think that probably would give you a false impression of the American voters. Yeah.
Thank you, Gina. We've profited from you in the past, and we hope to do so on radio in the future and here as well. Bruce, not the first time you're here and not the last time. Thanks for bringing evidence to discuss as we go into this fantastic year, into the elections, 9 months before the process gives birth to something new.
And this will be on our website, this PowerPoint. So if you want to take a look or download it or whatever, it'll be available.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Welcome again to the EU.